The Fall of the Republic. Prologue. The Final Gambit. With the southern border closed, the new Republican administration hoped to restore control over the nation. But the damage had already been done. Years of unchecked immigration, facilitated by the previous Democratic administration, had brought 21 million illegal aliens into the country, some through an app designed to streamline entry under the guise of humanitarian aid. Hidden among them were 100,000 military-aged men, trained fighters from various countries and factions, lying dormant, waiting for the signal to rise. Drug supplies dwindled, black markets dried up, and addicts began to die on the streets. The withdrawal crisis pushed major cities to the brink, with overdoses piling up in alleyways and hospitals overwhelmed by addicts fighting for any remaining hit. Civil unrest grew as the deep state cabal quietly orchestrated the next phase of their plan: destabilize the government and bring forth their own candidate in the name of public safety. The insurgency begins. Across the country, sleeper cells activated. The military-aged men, recruited from paramilitary groups, radical factions, and mercenaries, were now united into a single, organized force. With weapons smuggled in over the years and stashed in hidden caches, they coordinated simultaneous attacks in key American cities. They targeted police stations, National Guard armories, and communication networks, plunging entire regions into chaos. In Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Houston, armed groups seized control of neighborhoods and declared autonomous zones, daring the federal government to respond. In the Midwest, transportation hubs were attacked, disrupting supply chains and paralyzing interstate travel. A war on two fronts. The Republican president ordered martial law to contain the uprising, deploying National Guard units to restore order. But former military and intelligence operatives, loyal to the deep state, undermined the effort from within. These rogue agents leaked troop movements to the insurgents, sabotaged supply lines, and spread misinformation, eroding trust between commanders and their soldiers. The situation became dire when key generals turned against the president, aligning with the deep state. Under the pretext of national security, they called for the president's resignation and framed him as a dangerous authoritarian. Meanwhile, loyal military units found themselves under attack, not just by insurgents, but by rogue elements within their own ranks. "We have traitors among us," Commander Carlos Marquez warned the president during a tense briefing. "This isn't just a rebellion, it's an orchestrated takeover." The deep state's power play. As the crisis deepened, a former CIA director and prominent deep state operative, backed by corporate media and globalist elites, announced his candidacy for the presidency. Under the guise of restoring order and public safety, he promised to negotiate with the insurgents and unify the country. The Chinese government, watching from afar, poured resources into the campaign, discreetly funding sympathetic media outlets and think tanks to sway public opinion. The insurgency provided the perfect backdrop for the deep state's political takeover. The new candidate portrayed the Republican president as incompetent and authoritarian, blaming the administration for the economic collapse, drug crisis, and rising death tolls. Cities under siege began to side with the deep state, demanding federal troops withdraw and calling for the president's removal. A nation in collapse. The president's decision to shut down the border came too late to stem the tide. The flow of drugs had already been disrupted, and with addicts dying by the thousands, public anger boiled over. Riots erupted in cities where police forces had already been compromised, and protesters stormed state houses, demanding action. Meanwhile, the 21 million undocumented immigrants already inside the country became a flashpoint. As organized militias of foreign fighters seized control of neighborhoods and critical infrastructure, civilian populations began to arm themselves. The government's response fractured along ideological lines. Republican governors attempted to declare independence from the federal government, organizing their own state militias to defend against the insurgents. Meanwhile, blue state officials sided with the deep state candidate, openly defying the president's authority and refusing to cooperate with federal forces. Carlos and Raven. A last-ditch effort. As the nation teetered on the brink, Commander Carlos Marquez and Raven Eldridge realized that the only way to save the Republic was to expose the deep state's connection to the insurgency and the Chinese government. But time was running out, and the nation's infrastructure was collapsing too fast. Carlos and Raven tracked encrypted communications between deep state operatives and Chinese handlers, uncovering evidence of collusion between the insurgents and political elites. The evidence was damning, proof that the insurgency had been orchestrated to install a puppet leader aligned with globalist interests. But getting the information to the president was nearly impossible. Media networks controlled by the deep state refused to cover the story, dismissing it as conspiracy. Social media platforms censored leaks and flagged whistleblowers as disinformation. The two operatives had to rely on underground networks to distribute the truth, risking everything to expose the coup. The final showdown. As Carlos and Raven raced to deliver their findings, Washington, D.C. became the epicenter of the crisis. Insurgents, supported by deep state loyalists, launched an assault on the Capitol, seizing government buildings and demanding the president step down. In response, the president ordered the 82nd Airborne Division to secure the Capitol, leading to an all-out urban battle between federal troops and the insurgents. Smoke filled the skies as gunfire echoed through the streets of the Capitol. Tanks rolled down avenues, clashing with barricades set by militants, while helicopters circled above, exchanging fire with rooftop snipers. Amid the chaos, the deep state candidate took to the airwaves, demanding the president resign for the sake of peace. Foreign governments, including China, backed the call, threatening sanctions if the president did not step down. A fight for the Republic. With minutes to spare, Carlos and Raven infiltrated the deep state candidate's campaign headquarters, broadcasting the damning evidence of collusion between the insurgents, rogue military officers, and the Chinese government. The truth hit the airwaves, shocking the nation and turning the tide of public opinion. Loyal military units, reinvigorated by the revelations, rallied behind the president and pushed back against the insurgents. Federal troops reclaimed the Capitol, and key deep state operatives were arrested. The deep state candidate, now exposed, fled the country under the protection of Chinese agents. Epilogue. The price of freedom. Though the Republic was saved, the scars of the uprising ran deep. Millions of lives had been lost, and the economy lay in ruins. The border remained closed, but rebuilding the nation would take decades. Trust in institutions was shattered, and the political landscape remained fractured between those loyal to the Republic and those still aligned with globalist ideals. Carlos and Raven, having fought in the shadows to save the nation, disappeared once again into the darkness. Their work was far from over, new enemies would rise, and the storm was not yet over. The deep state may have been wounded, but it was not destroyed. And in the quiet moments after the battle, the president knew that freedom had only been bought for a time. For in a world ruled by shadows, the storm is always waiting to return.